Boldwood presents Missing for Good, written by Alex Coombs and read by Carolyn Bonnyman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Jamie MacDonald was waiting to kill someone. He looked again at the display on the dashboard. It read 1855, Monday the 24th of January. It didn't seem to have changed in what felt like an hour. The temperature outside was 5 degrees Celsius, about the same as a fridge. He was tense. Time was dragging, moving so slowly. "So who's paying for the hit?" he asked the man sitting next to him. "What?" Jordan McKenna replied, having been lost in thought. "I said, who's paying for the hit?" MacDonald said. The two of them, he and Jordan, were parked up in a small white van by the side of the road in Howe Street in Edinburgh's new town. It was a dark night, and a fine rain was falling. Jordan shrugged. "Some guy," he said, in a way that made it clear he wasn't going to talk about it. "You don't need to know." "Bet it's Miller," thought MacDonald. He looked out of the window away from Jordan and checked the side mirror. That was all he was going to get. It didn't really matter. He knew it was Miller. Jordan was Miller's man in Edinburgh. He glanced at Jordan, medium height and build, hunched in his puffer jacket behind the wheel. The orange streetlight outside shone on the two of them. He was a handsome guy, 35, but the years and the lifestyle were starting to catch up. In this light, he looked 10 years older. You could see the lines. Now, he took a tobacco pouch out of his jacket pocket and started to roll a joint. "What the fuck do you think you're doing, Jordan?" said MacDonald irritably. "What does it look like?" Jordan glared at him in an aggrieved way. "It's only a joint, for fuck's sake." "Put it away." Jordan shook his head irritably, but did as he was told. Nominally, he was in charge. But the reality was that the man sitting beside him called the shots. Jordan didn't want to offend the man he had hired. He had a terrifying capacity for violence, and Jordan was frightened of him. Numpty, thought MacDonald. Here they were in Edinburgh's elegant Georgian new town, just a short 5-minute drive along the cobbled streets from Bute House in Charlotte Square, where the First Minister lived. It was quite probable the police would be patrolling round here. And what did Jordan want to do? Smoke weed. 2 men in a small van. And not just 2 men. They looked like criminals. They were criminals. Why don't we just put up a sign saying, "Up to no good," he thought. He put his hand inside his pocket and felt the gun there. It felt reassuring. MacDonald was a formidable guy, his pecs visible through the dark blue jumper he was wearing. The huge muscles of his biceps bulked out his jacket. Hard, defined jail muscle. Jordan had met him at HMP Addywell at the time MacDonald was due for release on licence. 8 years for a barroom stabbing. When Jordan had been given tonight's job and heard MacDonald was available for hire, he'd asked him immediately. MacDonald wasn't the kind of guy to fuck up. What he hadn't factored in was MacDonald's newfound tetchiness, caused largely, in Jordan's opinion, by him giving up his 5-gram-a-day coke habit. "Run over again what we're going to do?" Jordan said. MacDonald said wearily, "When we see the girl, I get out and open the back doors. When she reaches the van, I stop her, get her in the back and off we go. You drive, I restrain her. Simple. She won't cause any trouble. She'll be too frightened. And if there's someone with her? Asked Jordan. His tone was insistent. MacDonald's nerves were taut. He could really do without this pointless questioning. One person, you get in the van with the girl. 2 people? He shook his head irritably. He was tired of this. There could be endless permutations. What if she arrived riding a camel? Fuck it, if there's 2 or more with her, we didn't do anything. OK. And then, if there's just her? Back to the original scenario. We drive out to Muirhouse. I deal with the girl. There was a yard that Jordan rented there. Even if anyone heard a gunshot in Muirhouse, they wouldn't bother too much about it. It was that kind of place. You minded your own business. MacDonald carried on. We put her in the other van and I take her away. You torch this van. We meet up tomorrow at Morris's Barn Partick, 12 noon. How are you going to dispose of her? My business. MacDonald's tone shut down any more questions. Jordan checked his watch. Here she comes. Good. She's alone. Lit by the orange streetlight, her long legs striding up the steep hill towards them, she wore jeans and Ugg boots and a woolen hat with a bauble of faux fur pulled down low over her face. Sure? This was her. He took a deep breath. This was the girl he was going to kill. Absolutely sure, Jordan said. Now was the moment. He got out of the van. Cold rain and a bitter wind. Now the adrenaline hit him as the coke used to. Now his heart was pounding as he psyched himself up for dealing with her. Now he felt a mix of panic and excitement. And then his eyes widened in recognition. Christ, it was her. Jamie, she smiled, her eyes sparkling with delight at seeing him. His right hand tightened around the gun in his pocket. Hello, Aurora, he said quietly. Chapter 2. To understand the present, we have to revisit the past. Hanlon thought of her therapist's words from 8 months previously. Do we, Dr. Morgan? Do we really? Speak for yourself, Doctor. I'm in the here and now. The target appeared in the crosshairs of the telescopic sight, the barrel of the .22 rifle resting motionless on her old folded barber jacket. A cold February afternoon. The gentle, chilly breeze tugged at her hair. She could smell the damp of the turf under her body, kept short by sheep grazing, and the tang of salt in the air from the sea. Clouds scudded across the hard, grey Scottish skies. Her breathing was steady. The bullseye at the centre of the concentric rings of the target motionless in the centre of the crosshairs. She gently squeezed the trigger, feeling the rifle kick. Hanlon glanced down at the dog beside her, waiting with good-natured patience. She ruffled the soft fur on Weem's head and stood up, slinging the rifle over her shoulder and walking over to the paper targets she'd been shooting at. She pulled them away from the old wooden fishing crate she'd gaffer-taped them to. Looking at the holes in the paper, she nodded, satisfied. It was good marksmanship. She stretched and looked down from the hillside where she was standing. It was a spectacular view. Below her was the rocky coastline of the east side of the Argyll Peninsula and the very blue waters of the Gulf of Arran. The island of Arran itself rose up majestically from the sea, its huge, craggy hills dominated by the largest of the peaks, Goat Fell, its summit a crazily jagged assembly of rock, like nature attempting a futurist modern art sculpture. Hanlon and the dog walked down the track that led to the road by the shore and the cottage she was renting. The land was frozen and cold. Dead brown bracken. The few stunted birch trees ghostly and skeletal. About half a mile away, she could see the roofs of the village of Skipness. Even village was pushing it. There was a church, a shop, a small school and a village hall, but there was just a small handful of houses there. She shook her head in wonder as she looked at it. She was a Londoner. She could never have predicted that she would end up living in such a small place. West of the village, accessible by a rutted track, was the tumble-down one-bedroom cottage she was renting. Its main attraction for her was the isolation. That and the price. It was hers until the holiday season started in May, just a few weeks away now, and then she would have to move on. She didn't mind. She had no roots. She could access her property by the path that led up to the hills, as well as by its drive that ran up from the road. She was walking down this track when she saw the car, slowly bouncing its way along the potholed road towards her house. Hanlon immediately dropped down into the bracken so she would be hidden from view, got her binoculars out and focused on the vehicle. The dog, obedient as ever, crouched by her side. The car was a black Audi estate. She didn't recognise it. She knew most of the cars in the village by now, and it wasn't one of them. The Audi parked in front of her cottage. The driver's door opened, and a man got out. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit and tie, dark-haired. It wasn't someone she knew. He walked up to the door, knocked and waited. When no one answered, he calmly walked back to the car and got in. Even from this distance, she could sense his self-possession. She saw him take a briefcase from the passenger seat, open it, remove some papers and start to read, making notes with a pen. He did not look threatening. Hanlon had made more than a few enemies in her life. She was always looking over her shoulder. This guy looked harmless. She stood up and walked down the track. As she drew nearer, he noticed her, put his paperwork down, opened the door and got out of the car. He looked very out of place in his suit and highly polished black Oxford brogues, standing outside the grey pebble-dashed cottage in the middle of the countryside. She walked up to him. He was tall, as she had surmised from a distance, and slim. She guessed he was about 40. He had a long, saturnine face and heavy, dark eyebrows. "Hanlon?" he asked. She nodded and watched as he ran an appraising gaze over her muddy walking boots, rifle in one hand, army surplus combat trousers, old cracked barber jacket. Weems, her dog, stood by her side, regarding the man suspiciously. "And you are?" she said. "My name's James Gillis." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and removed a business card. His suit was tailored and looked expensive. She took his card and glanced down at it. "A lawyer?" "A lawyer." He gave her another appraising look. "My employer asked me to meet you and bring you to him for a meeting." She frowned. "What, right now?" He nodded. "Right now." She looked at him, perplexed. Right now? True, she wasn't the easiest person to get in touch with, but surely an email wouldn't have been too difficult. He had managed to find her physical address after all. Whoever Gillis worked for must know her name, so they could have given her some kind of advance warning. "Who is your employer?" she asked. The tone in her voice was questioning, suspicious. Why not just call? Gillis' face was impassive. He's a prominent businessman. Really, she thought, a prominent businessman. Does he not have a name? Do you have to be so mysterious? A buzzard wheeled lazily in the air high above them. In the distance, on the grey loch, a fishing boat was visible on the horizon. She could hear the whine of a chainsaw in the wood down the road. Life was going on around them, while the two of them stood like some odd still-life tableau. Gillis out of place in his sombre suit and highly polished wingtip shoes. "Okay," she said. "Where does this prominent businessman want to meet me?" He ignored the sarcasm in her voice. "Near Oban," he said. Hanlon thought, that's going to be about a 2-hour drive, north, up the Argyll coast. 2 hours there, say an hour's meeting with the mystery man, then back. 5 hours. She wouldn't be home until after dark. "If you tell me what it's about, I'll consider it." There was no way she was going on a 4-hour journey without knowing why. "His daughter's disappeared," Gillis said. Missing persons, she thought. That sounded good to her. She looked at Gillis. No more was going to be forthcoming. She pointed at the dog. "He'll have to come too." "Fine." Gillis didn't miss a beat. She nodded at the rifle. "I'll just put this away." 5 minutes, Gillis said. He seemed a man of few words. She let herself into the cottage, left her boots on the mat by the door, and pulled on a pair of Air Max training shoes. Weems looked at her with interest as his tail swished on the floor. Training shoes meant a run, and he loved running. "Not today, boy." She ruffled the fur on his head. "We're going to meet a client." The dog looked at her, and she kissed his head. He sensed her excitement and wagged his tail. "That's right. A client." She grinned at the dog. "Our first one." The two of them left the house and she locked the door. The taciturn Gillis opened the hatch and the border collie jumped inside. Hanlon got in the passenger seat and Gillis climbed in. He started the car. "What's her name?" she asked. He turned his head and looked at her, frowning. "The missing girl," she prompted him. "What's her name?" "Aurora," he said. "Her name's Aurora." Chapter 3. The black BMW 4x4 drove slowly towards a block of flats in Clydebank in the west side of Glasgow. From the living room window on the 6th floor, Calla Lennox looked at the car with a growing feeling of unease. Drug dealer. Had to be. Nobody with money would be coming here otherwise, especially in a car like that. Calla had been born on the estate. She knew just about everyone who lived here. Aside from a couple of years in care homes and a period across the river in Port Glasgow, it had been home for most of her life. She was dyslexic. She couldn't write the word, but she knew a vehicle like that spelled trouble. "Drew, come here," she said to the man sitting with his feet up on the sofa. He was short and muscular, with a round, pleasant face and dark, spiky hair. He was wearing a Celtic away jersey and a heavy gold chain around his neck. He looked up from his phone. "What now?" he said in an exasperated tone. The baby had only just gone to sleep. "Come and look at this." The 4x4 was pulling up outside their block. She stared at it with troubled eyes. Calla's face was worried, her voice quiet. "Bloody women," he muttered to himself, putting his phone down. He went over to the window. "What?" She pointed at the car. They exchanged looks. They were both concerned now. Drew thought frantically. Had he had issues with anyone recently? Home, pub, small deals of Charlie and weed here and there, all local, all above board. These were some of the things running through his head. He didn't owe Frank, his supplier, any money. He hadn't cheated anyone. He was a reliable dealer. He didn't shortchange customers. Maybe it was nothing. Or if it wasn't, maybe it was nothing to do with him. Had someone fitted him up? Surely not. The BMW parked. They stared down at it far below, pulling up by the front door, the light glinting off its bodywork. It was like waiting for the curtain to go up before a show. Who was going to get out? Calla and Drew watched, holding their breaths, hoping to be able to release them in relief. Then the doors opened. 4 doors, all in unison as if choreographed, and 4 men got out. 3 pairs of trainers and 1 pair of highly polished black brogues hit the dirty tarmac outside the front doors of the tower block simultaneously. 3 men in bomber jackets. The one who had been sitting in the front passenger seat, wearing a tan Mac. He was much taller than the others. You could see that even from up here. He pushed some of his floppy dark hair back from his forehead and lit a cigarette. He suddenly looked upwards towards them. Calla knew it was impossible for him to be looking at her directly, but that was what it felt like. He took a few drags on his cigarette and then threw it to the ground, half-smoked. 3 of them headed inside. 1 stayed behind, leaning against the bonnet of the car. "God, it's the big man," Drew muttered. Calla somehow knew they were coming for them. "Oh, Jesus Christ, no," she whispered. Graham Miller strode into the lobby of the tower block, walking with the invincible self-confidence that practised violence gave you, flanked by his minders, Big Doogie and Ray. She had heard about them from Drew, although she had never met them. "What have you been up to, Drew?" wailed Calla. This woke the baby, who started to cry. She looked in anguish at her husband, then picked up her daughter, Palmer, and held her close. There, she said, soothing the baby. What had Drew been up to? Surely to God nothing he could have done would have warranted Miller's presence. He simply wasn't important enough. Miller controlled the drugs trade in Dumbarton and the other towns and suburbs like Clydebank on the western fringes of Glasgow. He was the guy who Drew's dealer brought his coke from. He was top of the food chain, and Ray was his second in command. "Nothing, woman," he snapped. He lit a cigarette. Calla looked at him with anguish. It was obvious to her that the same question that was going through her mind was going through his. The big man was here for a reason. But God knew what. Surely it could have nothing to do with him. He was too far down the pecking order to attract Miller's attention. But here he was, nevertheless. Drew walked into the bedroom and came out carrying a baseball bat. Her husband had a short fuse, and Calla could see that far from being intimidated by Miller, he was determined to take the initiative. "Put it down, Drew!" Calla shouted at him. "Don't be stupid!" He hefted the aluminium bat. Oh, God, the idiot. She could guess what he was thinking, that he'd show Miller. There was a pounding on the door. "Drew, it's Miller. Put the bat down," she begged, starting to cry. He shook his head. "Nobody fucks around with me in my own place, Calla," he said. Another couple of blows on the door. "Go and open it." he ordered her. She did so, and Big Doogie, about 6'4", raw-boned, his long, pale face and very light blue eyes topped by fine blonde hair, shoved the door open. She didn't say anything. Instead, she backed away from the door, terrified, Palmer cradled in her arms. Now the big man and Ray walked into the flat, and Doogie closed the door behind them and stood leaning against it. She had never met Miller, but she recognised him from descriptions. He was massive, with a hard, brutal red face and glittering eyes. The blue two-piece suit and raincoat somehow made him even bigger. He always wore a suit. She'd heard that. Rumour was true then. She felt like a small child in his presence. Drew, still holding his baseball bat, walked backwards as the two men came into the living room. What the hell did he think he was going to achieve, she thought. The idiot. Calla followed them, clutching her daughter like a talisman. Please, God, she prayed frantically, let her be all right. Please, God, let him not hurt her. Everyone was ignoring her as if she were just a piece of the furniture. That suited her just fine. The lounge had seemed perfectly large a minute or so ago. Now it seemed tiny, like a child's room, and she and Drew were the bairns, and here were the grown-ups to punish them. Miller was so close, she could have leaned forward and touched him. He was even bigger than she had imagined. He had very black hair, thick and coarse-looking, long on the top and cut short on the sides. It was sticking up here and there as though he had pushed his fingers through it. His eyes looked crazy. She could see he was high. Coke, probably. Why not? He'd sold enough of it. She shrank into the corner of the room, her arms wrapped tight around baby Palmer. The big man glanced at her. "You're Calla." "Aye, Mr. Miller," she said, swallowing nervously. She stared at the floor. She didn't want to meet his eye. "What do you want, Miller?" Drew said aggressively. "Shut up, you cretin," thought Calla, looking up, trying to catch Drew's eye. But that was Drew for you. He never had known when to back down. Like now. He was holding the bat in front of him, threateningly. Miller turned to look at him. For Calla, time seemed to stop. Like when you had a car crash. Everything happened in slow motion. "And just what the fuck do you think you're doing with that?" Miller was pointing at the baseball bat. Drew raised the bat menacingly. "What are you doing in my flat with these two pricks?" he said. Calla stared at the three men. The guy with Miller, Ray, was very good-looking. About 50, she guessed. She had thought he was young, but now, with her heightened senses, she could see the lines in his face. He had a flowery shirt under his jacket that looked expensive. Blue chinos, and properly good-looking trainers, not like the crap ones from the local market that Drew was wearing. Miller's face darkened. Like lightning flickering over a stormy sky. There was a sudden blur of movement. He moved very quickly without warning and hit Drew in the face. Drew cried out in pain, his hands covering his nose. Then Miller, grabbing the bat from him, drove the metal end hard into Drew's stomach. Drew doubled up and gasped for breath. Miller swung the bat into Drew's head as if he were hitting a ball out of the park. The noise was horrible. She winced. Drew's legs went and he collapsed. Calla squeezed her eyes tight shut. Then she heard a couple of dull thuds. Miller had dropped the bat and was hitting Drew, his face a kind of mask of animal rage. "Fucking threaten me, you fucking wee bastard, would you? Fucking would you?" The monologue was punctuated 4 times by his fist. Now her eyes were open, and she saw that there was something in his hand. Drew was face down, not moving. There was a lot of blood, so red, pooling from him, spreading out onto the carpet. Calla felt sick, and black spots danced in front of her eyes. "Please, God, let me not faint," she prayed. Her legs were like jelly. Blood on the hands of Miller, on his tan raincoat. Miller straightened up, breathing heavily. He turned to Calla, his face enraged. "Where's your fucking brother?" Miller said angrily. "Jamie MacDonald, where is he?" She shrank into the corner of the room, pressed herself hard against the wall for support. So this hadn't been about Drew at all. It was about Jamie. "Port Glasgow," she whispered. "He isn't there. We looked," Ray said, his face stern. "I don't know. I swear to God." Tears were running down her face. Miller took her chin gently but firmly in his bloody hand. Drew's blood. She could smell it. He looked into her eyes. His were hard, pitiless. They dropped down to the baby in her arms, to Palmer. "She is very small," he said. He put his head on one side. His eyes flickered meaningfully to the partially open window. She had no doubt he was capable of it. He was capable of anything. "Where is he?" he demanded. "I don't know," she whispered. "Please." Miller bent forward and leaned his head close to hers. "I've heard you're close to Jamie. When that brother of yours calls you, you be sure to find out exactly where he is," he said. His eyes didn't leave hers. She swallowed nervously. "Yes, Mr. Miller." "Good girl," he said approvingly. He took his hand away from her and turned away, staring down at Drew's body with a slight frown on his face. Miller left the room. Ray came up to her. He nodded in the direction of Drew. "I'll be round tomorrow with some cash for your expenses." Calla nodded. Ray didn't need to add, "for the funeral." She understood what he meant well enough. Ray paused at the door. "Clean up behind us," he ordered. "Oh, and it goes without saying, we weren't here." She nodded again. "You weren't here. None of you were here." She heard the door close behind them, and her legs buckled. She slid down the wall so she was sitting on the floor, and she started to cry. "Oh, Jamie, what have you done?" she whispered. Chapter 4. It was nearly 2 hours after leaving Hanlon's cottage in the small village that Gillis slowed and pulled off the road. She wasn't sure exactly where they were, only that it was about a 10-minute drive north of the town of Oban. Gillis had refused to make conversation during the journey. Hanlon had tried her best, but all she'd got had been monosyllables. After a while she gave up trying to engage with him and just looked out of the window as the beautiful landscape passed by. The further north they went, the rockier and wilder the countryside became. Occasionally they would drive past a standing stone in a field, deserted, mournful and mysterious. Nobody really knew why the stones had been placed there, nor what the mysterious cup and ring markings on them meant. They were just there, puzzling. Not unlike Gillis, she reflected. As the road twisted its way through the rocky hills, bare and forbidding at this time of year, she thought that this potential job offer could not have come at a better time. Finding work had been a hell of a lot harder than she had anticipated. After an hour, she closed her eyes and dozed. The entire journey had been spent in more or less complete silence, except for the music that had played continuously since they had left Hanlon's cottage. After 2 hours, she knew one thing for sure about the taciturn lawyer. He certainly had a thing for the blues. The entertainment display on the car's dash gave the name of the artist, so Hanlon, who wasn't keen on music of any description, by now was well aware of what the Robert Cray Band, Muddy Waters, Bessie Smith and Etta James sounded like. Depressing, to her way of thinking. Etta finished, and Robert Cray returned to let them know about his suspicions regarding his partner and her boss, suspicions that would inevitably lead to him moving out and living in some flop house, drinking whiskey for breakfast, if the pattern of earlier songs held true. Nobody ever seemed to get the blues and be motivated to do anything remotely useful about the situation, Hanlon reflected. She wondered if Gillis took this defeatist mindset into work with him. The road dropped down a hill with a view of the sea below them. It was practically dark now, the land in the distance a foreboding sable mass. The driveway they stopped at had an imposing entrance. 2 large stone pillars surmounted by crumbling lichen-encrusted lions and a set of double gates. The lions and pillars were old, but the gates were new. They were also large, made of metal bars surmounted by spikes disguised as ornamental and painted gold. But they looked sharp. Extremely sharp. They weren't just decorative. There was evidence of more attention to security. There were 2 CCTV cameras that were partly hidden by the plinth that the lions were on. On either side of the gate was a high metal mesh fence. Razor wire ran along the top. Gillis's boss obviously took security seriously, Hanlon thought. Gillis pressed a button on his key fob, and the gate swung slowly inwards. The drive was lined by tall rhododendrons, their mournful leaves funereally drab as the car slowly made its way along the meandering ribbon of tarmac. The sky above them was almost black now. It was a depressing arrival, shrouded in the darkness of the evergreen foliage on both sides and the gathering approach of night. They rounded a corner and the house came into view. "Kinachan House," said Gillis laconically. Hanlon almost jumped in her seat. It was about the only thing he'd volunteered until now. The place wasn't unusual for the west coast of Scotland. It was late 19th century style, built of dark stone, granite she guessed, and had the touches that Victorian Scots seemed to go for. Crenellations as a castle might have running along the roof, and circular turrets at the corners, the odd leaded window. The place was as sizable as it was ugly. Behind it, in the darkening gloom, she could see the sea and, beyond that, indistinct hills rising up high into the sky that might have been the island of Mull or part of the mainland on the other side of the loch. They were north of Oban now, and the lands surrounding them were as bleak and forbidding as they were beautiful. Gillis pulled up in front of the large wood-panelled door. A dozen or so security lights bathed them in their harsh white illumination. She noted the alarm boxes on the walls, no less than 3 of them, and the security cameras. She and Gillis got out of the car. The cold, salt sea breeze whipped into their faces, wet with drizzle. The lawyer released Weems from the back, and the dog ran to Hanlon to check all was okay, and then stood patiently by her side, sniffing the air and looking around him with interest. The door was opened by a guy, in his 30s she guessed, wearing a suit and a serious expression. He had a very short, military-style haircut, and a nose whose shape had been modified by severe punishment over the years. He nodded to Gillis, gave Hanlon a cursory glance, and then, ignoring her, spoke to the lawyer. "So you're here?" "He's waiting in the study." Gillis nodded, and the man suddenly turned to Hanlon with a charming smile. "I'm sorry. I'm forgetting my manners. You must be Hanlon. I'm Andy Hampton. I work for Mr. Cameron. Thank you for coming at such short notice. Please, follow me." The three of them walked into the house. In the lobby, Hampton paused and turned to Hanlon. "Can I take your coat?" She nodded and removed her old Barber jacket. He disappeared with it into a cloakroom by the door and reappeared seconds later. She looked around. She was feeling distinctly underdressed for this place. They were in a large hall, high-ceilinged and very long. There was a wide staircase running upstairs to the left. The decor was a total contrast to the outside of the house. That was traditional, 19th century baronial vernacular. Inside was classic, cool, modern. The hall floor had been restored to highly polished stone flagstones. A grey runner carpet ran the length of it. Modern art hung on the walls. The lighting was recessed. Far away, some Baroque music, maybe Bach, was playing. The three of them walked in silence down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the carpet. The dog walked slightly to one side of Hanlon, the claws on his paws clicking on the stone of the floor, the only sound above the music. They neared the end of the entrance hall, and then Hampton stopped. "In here, please." He knocked on one of the tall, wood-panelled doors and ushered them into a room. It was, in keeping with the house, large. There were floor-to-ceiling windows which overlooked the loch and the hills on the other side. The view would have been spectacular if it hadn't been so dark beyond the glass. The room was carpeted. There was a fireplace at one end with a log fire burning, a desk with a computer screen at the other. More art of a minimalist nature was on the wall, maybe 20 or so paintings. Modern, mostly abstract, except for one picture that stood out from the others, both in subject and style. It was a large oil painting of a woman standing and leaning over a table to look at a laptop. It was a view of her painted from behind. Her face was reflected in the window of the room. It was dark outside. It was very skillfully done, hyper-realistic. She looked as if she could just step out of the frame if she wanted to. The table in the painting must have belonged to an artist, maybe the one who made the picture. There were jars with brushes, tubes of paint, a wine bottle and glasses. She was young, blonde. You could tell she was beautiful. She was also naked. There was a man in the room standing with his back to them, looking out at the view. Gillis, Hanlon and the dog walked in, and the door closed behind them. The man staring out at the loch was tall. His hair was short and grey, skillfully cut. He turned around and faced them. He was not young, far from it. She guessed he was probably in his 60s, but he looked good for his years, trim and fit. No stranger to the gym and the cross-trainer. The colour of his hair matched his two-piece suit, which was beautifully cut, tailored to fit his slim figure. Like a concourse vintage car, he looked expensively maintained. "You must be Hanlon," he said. In one hand he had a small bottle of Czech lager that he was holding almost self-consciously, like it was a prop on stage. "Do sit down," He gestured with an open palm at the sofa and chairs that were arranged in a semicircle facing the windows, with a couple of low coffee tables in front of them. Hanlon glanced down at her worn, slightly muddy combat trousers, her old green jumper, and looked with irritation at Gillis. OK for him in his suit. She presumed she was here for a prospective job interview, and she was uncomfortably aware that she was dressed like some kind of handyman. "Can I get you a drink?" The guy's accent was educated Scottish. "Coffee, please. Black, no sugar," she said. He looked at Gillis, who, taciturn as ever, shook his head. He nodded, took his phone out and tapped on the screen, then repocketed it. "Right," he said decisively. He sat down in a chair slightly to the side of Hanlon. He took a mouthful of beer from the bottle in his hand. "Do you have any idea who I am?" No. Hanlon didn't see any need to elaborate. "There's no need to worry," he said reassuringly. It didn't seem politic to tell him she wasn't worried at all. "My name's Hamish Cameron." Hanlon wondered if he was going to feed her more and more snippets of information until she eventually guessed who he was. If so, they could be there some time. He smiled. "I'm an art dealer." "That's nice," Hanlon said. She guessed that explained the pictures and the security. He looked back at her expectantly. "So, how can I help you?" she asked. "I'm also a father," he said. "My daughter is missing." There was a lengthy pause. "I want you to find her for me." So, there we are, she thought. She felt a brief surge of excitement. This would be her first case since she had left the police and set up as a private investigator. "The police?" suggested Hanlon. "She's not been gone long enough for that. They would almost certainly tell me not to worry, that young people often go away for a period without warning." Cameron smiled ruefully. "And, of course, she's an adult, but—" He shook his head. "She's not been in her flat for a week. I know her flatmate is worried. He drank some beer. And I certainly am, which is the main thing as far as you're concerned." "Did the flatmate contact you?" she asked. Cameron shook his head. He looked slightly embarrassed by the question, seeming to search for the right words before saying, "No, I heard that she was missing." "You heard that," said Hanlon. "And your daughter? You've called her? Texted her? Emailed her?" "It's not that simple." Cameron frowned. "Unfortunately, she's not speaking to me. We fell out some time ago. Her mother died." He was wearing a wedding ring on his left hand, and she noticed he twisted it unconsciously as he spoke. "And she's blamed me for her death ever since." Hanlon looked at him, evaluating him in his expensive but casual suit and simple but oh so tasteful crushed linen shirt. On his wrist was a slender gold band that was his watch. She would bet it was ultra-expensive. His shoes were loafers that he wore without socks, just a hint of tanned ankle. He was the picture of both studied elegance and restrained control. Her mind, naturally suspicious, started speculating. An estranged father and daughter. She wondered about the control. Was that an issue? The daughter wasn't speaking to him. He hadn't spoken to the flatmate, yet somehow he knew the girl was missing. How could he have known? She thought of the CCTV, the alarms, the floodlights, his ex-army employee. Had he got her under surveillance too? "How old is she?" asked Hanlon. "Aurora's 23. She's in her final year of an MA in English Literature at Edinburgh University." Cameron's eyes locked onto hers. "She's the only child I have. My only family, really, now Julia's gone. I've lost a wife. I don't want to lose a daughter." "Well, as you yourself said, she's only been gone a week," Hanlon pointed out. "Shut up, you fool," she said to herself. "You trying to talk yourself out of a job?" Cameron shrugged. "Maybe it's nothing. But this has never happened before. I pay her credit card bills. I get to see what she's been spending and where. There's been no activity there. She has an allowance, not huge, but enough. All the same, it's very unusual for her not to use her plastic." Hanlon scratched her head. The whole thing smelled bad. A father who was not on speaking terms with his daughter, but, admittedly she was guessing, spied on her and tried to keep her tied to him financially. It had a strong odour of unhappy, dysfunctional family about it. Nothing cheery was ever going to come out of something like this. And she had taken a dislike to Cameron. On the other hand, she was broke. She was driving a 17-year-old Vauxhall Corsa, with a cassette deck as standard. And did it matter that she didn't like him anyway? He was a customer. "Okay," she said decisively, "with the proviso that when I find her, if she doesn't want me to tell you where she is or what she's up to, that decision is hers, and you respect it." Cameron made a kind of open palm gesture with his hands. "Absolutely," he said. "I don't want anything from her. I just want to know that she's all right." "Of course you do," thought Hanlon cynically. "So, if I find her, and she's okay but doesn't want to talk to you or communicate with you, you'll be happy with the photo?" He nodded. "I guess so," he sighed. "She's very, well, headstrong. It wouldn't surprise me if it came to that. I want reassurance more than anything." "I'll tell her you're worried about her," Hanlon said. He smiled sadly. "Thank you. A reunion would be nice too, but let's be realistic." "Good," Hanlon nodded. "That's settled then." The Corsa needed a new exhaust. She stood up. "I'll need information." Cameron nodded. "Gillis has prepared a pack for you. Pictures, bio, personal information." There was a silence, and they looked at each other. An antique grandfather clock in the corner struck 5. "I'll pay you 300 a day, plus reasonable expenses," he said. "That sounds fine," she said. It was more than she'd been expecting. She would have done it for a lot less. "Good," said Cameron briskly. They both stood up. He extended a hand and they shook. "Gillis will take you home," Cameron said, dismissing her. Gillis stood up. "Shall we go?" Hanlon looked at the lawyer with amusement. All those professional qualifications, to end up as a gopher for some rich guy. Maybe that was why he spoke so little. It was pent-up resentment. Maybe that was why he played the blues. Chapter 5. Ray pulled up outside the crack house in the BMW 4x4 and turned the engine off. "This the place?" asked Miller. Ray looked at Big Dookie sitting in the passenger seat. "Aye, this is the place." Miller put his hand on the baseball bat next to him in the back seat. "Nobody fucks me around," he said ominously. The three of them got out of the car. They were in Muirhouse, a less-than-lovely suburb of Edinburgh. The Crack House, a squat where you could buy and consume under the same roof, was in an area of social housing, quiet streets of two-storey, grey, pebble-dashed blocks of flats. As they got out of the car, a bitterly cold wind hit them. Dougie shivered. There was a burned-out car parked by the kerb opposite the house they were about to go in. The windows had been shuttered by the council to prevent break-ins, not that it had done any good. The door was metal too. A sunken-cheeked, hard-faced guy in his 20s stood outside, smoking a cigarette. It was 7 p.m. and dark. The street light outside the property wasn't working. Ray noticed the man standing guard by the door was looking at the three of them making their way towards him. The guy looked nervous, as well he might. They were all big men, but Miller, who was in the lead, was huge. Dark-haired, red-faced, wearing his cheap-looking blue two-piece suit, a baseball bat in one large, meaty hand. Judging by the expression on the doorman's face, he didn't think Miller was holding it because he wanted a game. Ray walked up to him and looked him in the eyes, seeing the fear there. He noticed him swallow nervously. Ray could see that he was supposed to mind the door. That would usually mean chasing away the street kids and keeping an eye out for the police, who occasionally drove past, or checking on customers, not dealing with situations like this. "What you want, pal?" the doorman asked, putting out a warning hand to stop him. Ray looked him in the eyes. The guy didn't see the punch coming, but he sure as hell must have felt it. He was on his knees, spluttering for breath. "Oh, Jesus!" he groaned. "Go," Ray ordered, pointing. The doorman painfully straightened up, did as he was told, and walked stiffly away down the street. He was clutching his chest. Ray guessed breathing was hurting him a lot. Ray opened the door and the three of them walked inside. Dougie closed the door and leant against it. The room was large and dimly lit by a lamp in the corner. There was a strong smell of weed, cigarette smoke and mould. It was very hot. There was an old-fashioned coal-effect gas fire on full. There was a battered vinyl sofa patched with duct tape, with a couple of junkies sitting on it who hadn't moved when the door had opened and the three of them had come in. A man wearing a leather jacket and a frown strode into the room through a doorway at the back. "Who are yous?" he asked, his voice harsh and challenging. "Where's Alan?" Miller demanded. Leather Jacket strode over to him, fists balled, aggression in every movement of his face and body. Miller looked steadily at him. He didn't say a word, then without warning and with great speed, swung the baseball bat at him mid-body. There was no avoiding it. The blow came too fast for that. But Leather Jacket moved quickly. He swiveled his body and took it on the shoulder. Miller was big and heavy, and the force of the bat when it impacted staggered the guy. He grunted in pain, but didn't go over, and Miller hit him again. This time, the bat made contact with his head. There was a dull thud, and he collapsed on the floor. The junkies didn't move. Neither did Leather Jacket. "What the fuck's going on?" Another man appeared from the doorway. Ray stepped forward, hit him hard, and the guy cried out and bent over, clutching his damaged face. Miller was on him, one hand hooked in his hair. "Hello, Alan. Remember me?" he snarled, as he yanked upward savagely. Alan gasped in pain. Miller pulled Alan's head close to his mouth. "Where's Jamie MacDonald?" Ray glanced around the room to check all was still in order. Doogie was still leaning against the front door of the crack den in case anyone tried to come in, watching as Miller and Ray dragged Alan inside the kitchen and slammed the door behind them. In the room they'd just left, the junkies were still motionless. One of them was asleep. The other was gouching away, the kind of head nodding that heroin users do, and absent-mindedly scratching. He had long, greasy hair and a painfully thin-lined face. Now he opened his eyes and nodded at Big Doogie, who put a warning finger to his lips. Doogie was from Edinburgh, and he knew the guy vaguely. Junkie Dave. Dave took the hint and closed his eyes. The guy who Miller had hit was still on the floor. He hadn't moved. In the kitchen, Alan was sitting on a chair. Ray stood behind him and Miller faced him, leaning on the kitchen table, smoking a cigarette. "Where's Jamie MacDonald?" "Dinna ken." He looked pleadingly at Miller. "You know I wouldn't lie to you, Graham. Please." Miller took a deep drag on the Marlborough and narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Alan's blood-stained face, Ray had broken his nose, looked pleadingly up at him. "Jordan McKenna was doing a job for me a week back," Miller said irritably. Ray glanced at his boss nervously. Miller had developed a mania about people letting him down, like Jordan, or betraying him, or just getting in the way like that moron in the leather jacket he'd just hit. He was uncontrollable if he felt that someone was trying to put one over on him. He'd already killed one person that day, and Ray was worried that it might not end there. Miller glared at Alan. Alan shivered in fear, and Miller took out his hip flask and had another hit of Bowmore. Ray watched him take a second, appreciative mouthful. Then he pulled a wrap of coke out of his breast pocket, tipped some onto the back of his hand and snorted it. His eyes bulged. He inhaled some smoke from the cigarette, looked down at Alan and continued. "Jordan hired MacDonald to help. Neither have been seen since." He prodded Alan in the chest with the end of the bat. "It's not like Jordan to do a runner." Alan tilted his head up to focus on Miller. "Jordan's got a place near here. A wee lock-up with a wee bit yard," Alan mumbled. His lips were cracked and bloodied. "Have you looked there?" "Address," Miller said. Relief washed over Alan as he started to speak. Ray could see it on his face. Ray thanked God he was able to give Miller something. Jordan's yard was about 5 minutes' drive away from Alan's place. As they left, Doogie bent forward and slipped 50 quid into the front pocket of Junkie Dave's denim jacket. "Nice one, big man," Dave whispered. Jordan's yard was in a quiet, semi-industrial street. On one side was a steel fabricating business. On the other, a cul-de-sac with some lock-up garages. Opposite were some flats and an access road. Doogie pulled over just outside the gate and they got out of the BMW. They walked up to the entrance. There was a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Access was via a metal gate padlocked shut with a heavy chain. They could see a small breeze-block garage, some wheelie bins, and a white van inside the compound. They examined the padlock and chain. Miller rattled it experimentally. "There's bolt cutters in the back of the car," Ray said. "Get them," Miller said. He reached a hand inside his jacket and took out the hip flask. Ray smelled the perfumed whiskey fumes as he unscrewed the cap and drank. Doogie returned from the car, put the jaws of the bolt cutters around the heavy links of the chain, and, grunting with effort, forced the handles together. The metal parted and the chain fell open slackly with a metallic, scraping sound. Ray pulled his gloves on and opened the gate. It sagged slightly on its hinges, and its bottom scraped along the ground. They slipped inside, and Miller led the way over to the van. Ray glanced inside. He could see it was unlocked. They walked to the back and stood there staring at the closed doors. Ray wrinkled his nose against the smell. They looked at each other. There was a heavy odour of rotting meat. He opened the door. There was a body wrapped in polythene sheeting. A pair of feet wearing worn trainers poking out. The smell was terrible. Doogie put a hand to his mouth. Ray could see he was gagging slightly. "Guard the gate, Doogie," he said. Gratefully, Doogie moved away from the van and its terrible contents. Miller watched him walk away from the van and turned to Ray, his slab-like face impassive. "Go and check," he said. "See which one it is." Ray nodded, opened the driver's door and leaned in. He tugged the plastic away from the head that was just behind the front seat. He emerged, coughing, and nodded. He took a couple of deep breaths. "It's Jordan," he confirmed. Miller nodded. He didn't seem surprised.